You ever notice how two people can live side by side, work the same land, wake up before the sun, and still end up with totally different lives? One looks worn down, like the days have been dragging him behind a truck. The other somehow has time to breathe, time to laugh, time to sit on a porch with a warm mug and a steady heartbeat. And it makes you wonder, in that quiet, slightly painful way, what am I missing? Tom Harrison lived in the kind of rural Midwest place where the horizon feels wide enough to hold your thoughts. 10 acres of inherited land. A small farmhouse with paint that had seen better decades. A barn that leaned just slightly, like it was tired but still trying. The world out there was not loud. It was whined through corn stubble, gravel under tires, distant dogs, and the honest, stubborn rhythm of work. Tom was 52, and he carried his years the way some men carry a heavy toolbox. Not graceful, not easy, but always close. Every morning, he got up at 4, not around 4, 4. The kind of 4 where the sky is still black and the house is still asleep, the air feels like cold water in your lungs. He'd swing his feet onto the floor, find his boots by memory, and step into the quiet like it was a job requirement. Sarah, his wife, would turn over sometimes and mumble something half asleep. Tom would lean down, kiss her forehead, and whisper, "I'm headed out." Sometimes she'd say, "Be careful," the way you say it when you've said it 1,000 times and still mean it every time. Tom would grab his jacket, his hat, and a thermos of coffee that wasn't fancy but did the job. Then he'd go outside to meet the day before the day was ready to meet him. He did everything the way his parents did it, the way his grandparents did it. Work hard, keep your head down, don't complain. That was the recipe. And in Tom's mind, there was something almost sacred about suffering through it. If you were tired, you kept going. If your hands blistered, you wrapped them and kept going. If the soil was dry, you hauled water and kept going. Because that's what good men did. The trouble was, Tom's land was dry. Not dramatic drought on the news dry, just stubborn dry. The kind that makes the dirt crack and makes the plants look like they're holding their breath. And Tom watered the way he always had. Buckets. Not a few buckets. Not a workout. Buckets like a lifestyle. He'd haul water from a spigot, carry it out, pour it at the base of plants, walk back, fill again, repeat until his shoulders burned and his lower back felt like someone had tightened a bolt in it. By mid-morning, he'd be drenched in sweat even when the air was cool. By late afternoon, he'd feel that strange mix of pride and irritation. Pride because he'd worked hard. Irritation because the results were never quite what he believed they should be. He grew a little of everything. Some tomatoes, peppers, squash, green beans, a patch of potatoes, a few rows of whatever he thought might sell at the small local market. Tom believed in spreading his effort wide, like casting a net. But nets, he was learning, can get heavy when you're the only one holding them. Across the fence line, his neighbor Bob Madsen lived on nearly the same amount of land. Same age, too. Same local weather. Same soil type, more or less. And yet, Bob's place looked better. Not in a flashy way. Bob didn't have a mansion. He didn't have fancy tractors parked like trophies. His house was simple. His truck was older than Tom's. But Bob's fields looked healthy. The plants were fuller. The rows were cleaner. And somehow, Bob always had time. Time to sit on his porch with coffee in the morning. Time to wave. Time to talk. Time to watch his grandkids chase each other in the yard on Sunday afternoons. Tom noticed, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. One morning, as the sun was finally pushing its way up over the tree line, Tom paused at the fence and watched Bob on his porch. Bob was holding a mug like it was the easiest thing in the world. Tom's hands were wrapped around the bucket handle. Bob spotted him and lifted the mug in a friendly salute. "Morning, Tom." Tom forced a smile. "Morning," Bob called out. "How you holding up?" Tom almost answered honestly. Almost. Instead he said, "Same as always." Bob nodded like he understood, but his eyes stayed kind. "Come have a cup," Bob offered.
"Coffee's still hot."
Tom looked down at his bucket and then back at Bob. "Can't," Tom said. "Work to do." Bob didn't argue. He just said, "All right, maybe later." Tom walked away with that familiar tightness in his chest. He told himself, Bob's just lucky. He told himself, Bob probably got some extra money somewhere. He told himself, maybe Bob's not working as hard, but he'll catch up to him. That's what Tom told himself. But the truth was, Tom didn't know. And not knowing started to feel like a splinter under the skin. Weeks passed. The weather stayed dry. Tom kept hauling buckets. Sarah tried to talk to him about it one evening when he came in late, dusty and tired, his shirt clinging to his back. She set a plate in front of him. He barely looked at it. "You didn't eat lunch again, did you?" she asked. "I was busy." "You can't keep doing this," she said, not angry, just worried. Tom stabbed at his food. "This is farming." Sarah leaned on the counter, arms crossed loosely. "No," she said softly. "This is you trying to carry the whole world on your back." Tom's jaw tightened. He hated when she made it sound like a choice. Because if it was a choice, then maybe he was choosing wrong. And that thought made him feel small. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to do," he said. Sarah didn't push. She just watched him eat like she was watching a candle burn down. Outside, the crickets sang like they didn't have a care in the world. A few mornings later, Tom felt something strange while he was out in the field. Not a dramatic pain, more like a warning. His chest felt tight. His head felt foggy. His arms were heavy, like the buckets had filled with stones. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself to keep moving. He carried water. He poured. He walked back. Halfway to the spigot, his vision narrowed, like someone was slowly closing a curtain. Tom stopped, set the bucket down, and tried to breathe. The sky tilted. And then the world went quiet. When he came to, he was lying in the dirt. His cheek pressed into the dry ground. His hat was a few feet away. The bucket had tipped over, leaving a dark, wet patch that was already soaking into the thirsty soil. For a moment, he didn't understand where he was. Then he heard a voice. "Tom. Hey, Tom. You with me?" Bob's face appeared above him, worried, serious. Tom blinked. "Bob," Bob exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. "Yeah, it's me." "Don't move too fast." Tom tried to sit up. Bob put a hand on his shoulder to slow him. "Sarah called," Bob said. "She's on her way. I saw you go down from my yard." Tom's throat tightened with embarrassment. "I'm fine." Bob shook his head. "You passed out in the field. That's not fine." Tom looked away. His face burned, not from sun, but from shame. Sarah arrived, breathless, her hair pulled back in a quick knot, worry written across her whole body. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Oh my God," she whispered, touching his face, then his arm. "Tom." "I'm okay," Tom said, but his voice wasn't convincing. Sarah's eyes were wet, and she tried to keep her tone steady. "We're going to the clinic." Tom started to protest, but Bob cut in gently. "Let her," Bob said. "Sometimes your body pulls the emergency brake for you." Tom didn't like that phrase. It made too much sense. At the small clinic in town, the nurse checked his blood pressure and frowned. The doctor asked him questions Tom didn't want to answer honestly. "How much sleep are you getting? How often do you eat during the day? How much water do you drink? How many hours do you work?" Tom gave answers that were half truth and stubborn pride. The doctor looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You're not a machine." Tom stared at the floor. Sarah held his hand, squeezing like she was trying to anchor him back to earth. They went home with instructions that sounded suspiciously like common sense, but common sense is easy to ignore when you're determined. Rest, eat, hydrate, slow down. Tom sat on the edge of his bed that afternoon, boots still on, staring at the wall. For the first time in a long time, he felt scared. Not of failure in the crops, not of money, not of the drought, scared that he might actually break. Later that evening, after Sarah finally convinced him to drink a full glass of water and eat something besides, whatever's convenient, Tom stepped outside onto the porch. The air had cooled. The sky was soft with fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor hummed like a low lullaby. Tom saw Bob walking up the driveway, slow and unhurried. Bob stopped at the bottom step. "How are you feeling?" Tom hesitated. His pride wanted to speak first, but his exhaustion got there before pride could. "Honestly," Tom said. Bob nodded. Tom swallowed. "I feel stupid." Bob didn't flinch. He just sat down on the porch step like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Stupid is a strong word," Bob said. "I'd go with tired." Tom stared out at the yard. "I don't get it," he said quietly. "I work all day. I work harder than anyone I know. And I'm still behind." Bob was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "You ever see someone chopping a tree with a dull axe?" Tom frowned slightly. "Sure." Bob nodded toward Tom's hands. "They swing harder, they sweat more, they get mad at the tree. And the whole time, the axe stays dull." Tom's jaw tightened again, but not in anger this time, more like recognition. Bob continued, voice calm. "When my dad was still around, he used to say, 'If you don't stop to sharpen, you'll spend your life swinging.'" Tom let out a short breath. "So you're saying I'm doing it wrong?" Bob lifted his shoulders. "I'm saying you're doing it the hard way." Tom looked at him finally. "Then what are you doing? Because it sure looks easier over there." Bob smiled a little. "It's not magic." Tom waited. Bob said, "Come on, I'll show you something." Tom almost said no. Habit made him want to refuse help. But his body still felt heavy, and his pride didn't feel as strong as it used to. So he stood up, and they walked. They crossed the yard, moved along the fence line, and stepped onto Bob's property. Bob led him to the edge of the field where neat rows of crops stretched out, greener than Tom's. Tom squinted. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" Bob pointed down. Thin black lines ran along the base of the rows, almost hidden, like quiet veins. Tom stared. "What is that?" "Drip irrigation," Bob said. Tom blinked. "You mean—" "That waters everything," Bob nodded. "Slow and steady. Right where it needs to go." Tom's mouth opened slightly. "How much did that cost?" Bob scratched his chin. "Not cheap. But not impossible. I saved up for a while. And I didn't do it all at once. Started with one section. Then expanded." Tom's mind raced, doing the kind of math he'd avoided because it felt like admitting his old way wasn't enough. Bob walked him farther down. "And see this?" Bob pointed to a small shed near the edge of the field. "That's where I keep my filters and timers," Bob said. "So I'm not out here guessing. It runs early morning and late evening when the sun's not stealing half the water before it even hits the soil." Tom stared like he'd just been shown a secret door. Bob kept talking, but not like he was lecturing, more like he was telling a story. "I used to do buckets too," Bob said. "My shoulders were wrecked. My back was wrecked. I'd come inside, and my wife would look at me like she was watching a slow disaster." Tom's throat tightened. Bob shrugged. "One day, I realized I was spending most of my energy moving water instead of growing plants." They walked again. Bob stopped by a patch of crops that looked especially healthy. "And I stopped trying to grow everything," Bob said. "I picked a few things that do well in this soil and this weather. I focused. Got good at those." Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "But what if the market changes?" Bob nodded like he'd thought about that too. "It might. But spreading yourself thin doesn't protect you. It just wears you out." Tom looked at the rows again, then back at Bob. "So you work less?" Bob smiled. "I work smarter. I still work. I'm not on vacation out here." Tom's lips twitched slightly, almost a laugh. Bob continued. "And I sleep. I eat. I take Sunday off. I sit with my grandkids, not because I'm lazy, but because I want to be alive long enough to enjoy what I'm building. That sentence landed in Tom's chest like a weight and a relief at the same time. They stood there for a moment as the wind moved gently through the leaves. Tom's voice came out rough. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Bob looked at him, eyes steady. "Tom, I tried. I offered coffee 100 times. Tom felt his face heat again. "Yeah," he muttered. Bob wasn't unkind about it. He just said, "You weren't ready to hear it." Tom nodded slowly. That night, Tom sat at the kitchen table with Sarah. Not the eat fast and collapse kind of sitting. The quiet kind. The thinking kind. Sarah poured 2 mugs of tea and sat across from him. Tom stared into his cup. "Bob showed me his setup," he said. Sarah didn't look surprised. She just waited. Tom swallowed. "I think I've been trying to prove something." Sarah's eyes softened. Tom continued, "Like if I suffer enough, it means I'm doing it right." Sarah reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You don't have to earn rest," she said. "And you don't have to earn peace." Tom blinked hard, and for a second he looked like he might cry, but he held it back the way men like Tom often do. The next week, Tom did something that felt strange. He stopped. Not forever, just long enough to think. He called the local farm supply store and asked about drip irrigation. He watched a couple of simple how-to videos online. He talked to Bob again, this time with a notebook in his hand, asking questions like a man who had finally admitted he didn't know everything. Bob even came over one afternoon, helped Tom map out the field. "Start small," Bob said. "You don't have to rebuild your whole life in a week." Tom nodded. "I'm good at trying to do that," he admitted. Bob chuckled. "I noticed." They set up the first section together. It wasn't perfect. Tom mismeasured a line. They had to redo part of it. Tom got frustrated, then caught himself, then laughed a little at his own impatience. Sarah watched from the porch, arms folded, smiling, like she was seeing her husband come back from somewhere far away. Over the next month, Tom changed a few more things. He narrowed his crops, focused on what grew best. He stopped planting out of panic. He started eating lunch, a real lunch, not just coffee and stubbornness. He started going to bed earlier, not at 9 like a saint, but earlier than midnight like a man who wanted his heart to keep working. He began taking short breaks without feeling guilty, sitting for 5 minutes under the shade of the barn roof, listening to the birds, letting his mind unclench. And slowly, something shifted. The work didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling like punishment. The soil held moisture longer. The plants looked steadier. The rows grew more even. The yield by late season shocked him. It wasn't a little improvement. It was the kind of improvement that makes you stand in the field and just stare, quiet, like your own life is surprising you. When harvest came, Tom ran the numbers twice because he didn't trust them. 40% higher than last year. He sat down on the tailgate of his truck and laughed, loud enough that Sarah came running outside, worried something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. Tom looked up at her, eyes bright, cheeks flushed, not from exhaustion but from something almost like joy. "I think," he said, still laughing, "I've been carrying water like an idiot." Sarah's shoulders dropped with relief, and she laughed too, wiping at her eyes like she was pretending she wasn't crying. The real proof wasn't just in the harvest. It was in Tom. His shoulders didn't slump as much. His face looked less tight. He didn't snap as quickly. He started humming sometimes, quietly, without realizing it. One afternoon, a neighbor in town saw him at the feed store and said, "Tom, you look different." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" The man smiled. "You look younger, like you got some sleep for once." Tom chuckled, and for the first time, he didn't take pride in being exhausted. He took pride in being well. On a Sunday morning not long after harvest, Tom sat on his porch with Sarah. 2 mugs of coffee. the kind Bob always seemed to have. The sky was pale blue. The air smelled like dried leaves and distant wood smoke. Sarah leaned her head lightly on his shoulder. Tom watched the land, his land, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude, not the loud kind. The quiet kind that settles in your chest and makes you breathe deeper. Tom took a sip and said, almost to himself, I thought I had to suffer to deserve this. Sarah looked up at him. And now, Tom exhaled slowly. Now I think, I just had to learn, Sarah smiled. You did. Tom sat there a moment, then added, Bob was right. Sarah's eyes twinkled. I know. Tom laughed under his breath. They sat in silence for a bit, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It felt full. Then Tom said, You know what scares me? Sarah turned slightly. What? Tom looked out at the field again. How long I thought hard meant right. Sarah squeezed his hand. You're here now. Tom nodded. Yeah, he said softly. I'm here. Later that day, Bob stopped by, as he often did, walking up the driveway with that familiar easy pace. Tom stood up and stepped off the porch. Bob lifted a hand. How's the sharpened axe doing? Tom shook his head, smiling. Don't get too proud of yourself, Bob grinned. I'll try. Tom glanced at the mugs on the porch swing. You want a coffee? Bob's smile widened. I thought you'd never ask. And the three of them sat there for a while, talking about the weather, the crops, the small things that somehow matter the most when life finally slows down enough to notice them. Tom listened to Sarah laugh. He listened to Bob's stories. He listened to the wind move through the trees, and he realized something simple. Life wasn't asking him to grind himself into the ground to prove he was worthy. Life was offering him a chance to learn, adjust, breathe, and still do good work. He could keep planting. He could keep building. But he didn't have to do it with a dull blade. Not anymore. That evening, after Bob went home and the sun lowered behind the fields, Tom stood at the edge of his land for a moment longer than usual. He looked at the neat lines, the healthy soil, the quiet system of water doing its job without drama. He thought about the day he collapsed, and instead of feeling shame, he felt something else, a calm kind of relief. Because sometimes the most meaningful change isn't a big, shiny transformation. Sometimes it's just a man finally giving himself permission to stop, sharpen his tools, and come home with enough strength left to sit on the porch and say, this is good. This is enough. And for the first time in a long time, Tom went to bed that night not feeling defeated. He went to bed feeling hopeful, and a quiet, steady kind of peace followed him there.